will examine blood rituals, that is, self-injury, in the Nordic black metal milieu, and attempt to make sense of them through the theoretical lens of an ongoing re-enchantment of the world, where popular culture has a mediating function. The material consists of various public statements by black metal musicians in television, radio and magazine interviews, song lyrics, liner notes and imagery from music releases, as well as 14 interviews conducted by me. The small sample of direct ethnographic data is naturally not sufficient to give a complete picture of the milieu, but a greater number of casual conversations about the topic that I have had with adherents of this type of Satanism indicate that these informants are indeed representative. Now, the Satanism this paper deals with is the variety that first emerged around 1990 in the Nordic, or more specifically Norwegian and Swedish, black metal milieu. The Church of Satan, founded by Anton LaVey in 1966, had propagated a more or less atheistic teaching focused on sensual pleasure of all types. Satan, to LaVey, was the symbol of man's carnal desires, and Christianity, with all its prohibitions and false morale, was the real evil. In stark contrast to this playful and ironic Epicureanism, black metal Satanism celebrated evil for evil's sake, worshipped Satan as an actual conscious spiritual entity, and was strongly ascetic. An integral element of this was ritual self-injury, which leading figures practiced on stage as well as in private, and promoted in interviews. In order to put this in context, let us briefly consider some historical examples of self-harm in the Western Hemisphere's Christian culture. There are several references to the phenomenon in the Bible. For example, the prophets of Baal attempt to commune with their god by cutting themselves with swords and lances till the blood gushed down upon them. This then is held up as a despicable practice bound up with the worst form of idolatry. The New Testament offers an account of a man possessed by demons who cuts himself using stones. In Philippians, Paul says Christians should avoid those mutilating the flesh. However, we can also find some passages that can be taken to symbolically indicate self-injury may in fact be pleasing to the Lord. The very same Paul in Corinthians says, "I chastise my body and bring it into subjection." There is thus some ambiguity concerning this matter in the Holy Writ, as it is connected on the one hand with the idolatrous false religion of the Baal worshippers and being possessed by demons, and on the other, in a numerically greater number of passages, with complete devotion to God. Passages like the latter ones probably partly form the background to certain early Christians provoking persecution in order to be tortured or even executed, as they believed this was the ultimate display of faith. Such deliberate martyrdom represents an indirect form of self-injury behavior. Fully direct, by contrast, is the self-castration reputedly performed by the influential early theologian Origen and a number of other early Christians. A more general mortification of the flesh, intended to renounce the body and its desires in a less irreversible manner, or as a penance, has in fact been fairly common within many monastic orders, and in certain contexts also among lay Catholics. Extreme examples include whipping oneself or wearing a highly uncomfortable cilice. While the types of self-injury behavior described above are usually associated with the Catholic Church, it has historically been present within Protestantism as well, and is thus a continuous feature in both the major forms of Christianity. By contrast, self-harm has not been present in any of the major forms of Satanism before the advent of black metal. Anton LaVey's Epicurean Satanism worshipped the ego and the flesh, and he would certainly have considered self-injury pointless and appalling. If we instead turn to popular music, we find artists cutting themselves on stage already in the late 1960s, when Iggy Pop would occasionally do so during performances with his band The Stooges. The sole aim here was obviously provocation. Possibly inspired by this, the 70s saw punk rock musicians follow suit. Highbrow performance art has been no stranger to bloody extravagances either, and shares some of the boundless radicalism of the black metal genre. In this context, there is interestingly a pronounced ritual element in the blood-soaked art events of the Wiener Aktionismus pioneer Hermann Nietzsche's infamous Orgien Mysterientheater from the early 1960s until the late 1990s. Self-injury, then, can be a socially sanctioned, that is, non-pathological, phenomenon in certain contexts, such as monastic orders, rebellious rock music, or avant-garde art. Framing it as religious seems, provided the person stays within certain prescripted roles, to be one of the more effective ways of receiving social approval for what would otherwise be seen as completely mad, self-destructive actions. As psychologist Armando Favazza has pointed out in his influential study of such behavior, in a different historical and cultural context, these individuals might instead have been held up as holy and venerable. That what is pathological or not is culturally determined is a truism, but it bears pointing out in this case. Following Favazza's suggestions about always carefully placing self-injury behavior in its proper social context, one way of approaching the phenomenon in black metal is via the fact that these acts take place in a communal sphere, the black metal milieu, where such exploits are indeed deemed meaningful and valuable. They are thus, in this sense, socially, or perhaps counterculturally, sanctioned, rather than idiosyncratic and pathological in nature. Moreover, the individuals that I discuss seem to largely follow a Christian cultural script with deep historical roots. Adhering to said script may not necessarily be a fully conscious act. Among the main innovators of black metal Satanism were Øystein Euronymous Aarseth in Norway and the Swedes Tony Särke and Per Yngve Olin. The latter two both engaged in self-injury behavior. Olin, who relocated to Norway to become the vocalist in Aarseth's band Mayhem in 1988, would cut himself severely on stage. Särke famously made audio recordings of his own and bandmate Morgan Håkansson's grunts and cries while self-injuring, which appeared on the albums of their experimental band Abruptum. In 1993, Aarseth was murdered by a rivaling black metal musician. The Norwegian scene continued to be strong, but the emphasis on Satanism would henceforth gradually become comparatively stronger in its Swedish equivalent. Since at least the mid-1990s, it has been the primary arena of attempts to ritualize and religionize black metal. Using music as religious propaganda is naturally nothing new. A great portion of classical music could be classified thus. Popular music, too, is full of examples, from Johnny Cash's pious Christian country ballads to the so-called Krishnacore subgenre of punk rock in the early 1990s, which promoted ISKCON ideology. In terms of making Satanism the primary purpose of a music genre, the Nordic black metal scene was, however, something completely new. The first to actually present a developed discourse on self-injury as a satanic ritual, and an integral part of Satanism at that, seemed to have been the Swedish band Dark Funeral in the mid-1990s. Their statements were moreover made not in obscure fanzines, but in mainstream mass media, thus reaching a wide audience. A 1995 interview with the magazine Chili, which was distributed for free to all gymnasium students, that is 16 to 19-year-olds in Sweden, featured a big photo of the band's guitarist Black Moon cutting himself with a razor. Explaining this to the disconcerted reporter, he stated, "You sit by yourself or with friends. It happens often. It is incredibly common in black metal and Satanism to cut yourself." He then went on to say, "You do it to gain something spiritually. You enter an evil mood when you do it. You release pain and zealousness. The comprehensive distribution of this interview among Swedish adolescents would have made sure it became influential. The same applies to the 1996 radio appearance where a different member of Dark Funeral and his wife discussed their self-harm rituals. It was broadcast several times on national radio, and here Emperor Magus Caligula and Ishtar discussed private rituals where they cut or burned themselves. The purpose was to sacrifice blood and pain to Satan and his demons, and in return, they claimed, gain material wealth and influence over others. A few months later, the couple appeared on Swedish national television, largely reiterating their statements from the radio show. "Why give blood to Satan?" the reporter asked. Ishtar answered, "Because it is the most powerful you can give of yourself, unless you want to give your own life." Ishtar participated in another television show the year after, performing an invocation, cutting herself on camera, and then stepping down into a bathtub filled with blood. Once more, she elaborated on the great importance of blood in satanic rituals. On the same show, Black Moon was also featured, and stated that he performs blood rituals to celebrate Satan. Asked to expand on exactly what this entails, he explained, "That I cut myself, simply, sacrificing my own blood. It's like releasing the inner evil you have within." These declarations may not have been theologically sophisticated, but certainly got the point across to the viewers that self-injury was seen by Satanists as a sacrifice to the devil. Just like Ishtar, Black Moon was also filmed cutting his arm. Sensationalist media reports of this type were instrumental in spreading the concept of self-injury as integral to Satanism. Statements by Satanists in the media were, however, decidedly not the only source for this. If we consider black metal song lyrics, there are a great number of references to ritual self-injury, especially among Swedish bands. These ideas can be found in other countries as well, as testified by the example of French band Antaeus. Their singer MKM is both an ardent self-injurer and respected in the milieu as a dedicated Satanist. Signaling this, they gave one of their albums the title "Cut Your Flesh and Worship Satan." Another Swedish band is Shining. The title of a recent EP, 5 Valid Reasons for Self-Inflicting Harm, is telling when it comes to their lyrical concept. Following the ritualizing template, Shining's homepage lists upcoming concerts under the heading Upcoming Ceremonies. Their song lyrics make it quite clear that the self-injury theme that Shining is based around is firmly grounded in Satanism. In the song Submit to Self-Destruction from 1998, the lyrics state, "Cruel punishment of self-destruction, a way of letting him in. My wounds cannot be counted in numbers, everything for his glory." Even more unswerving was the homepage of what is today no doubt Sweden's most famous black metal band Watain, which used to feature a gallery of grotesque photographs of self-injuries from the black metal milieu. This subpage was headed by the exhortation, "Bleed for the Lord," that is Satan, "let him breathe through you." Many of the conversations I have had with black metal Satanists about self-injury closely reflect the ideas propagated in lyrics and media appearances. However, a number of the informants also offered more elaborate and sophisticated ruminations. Several of them stress self-harm's function as a form of resistance, typically to biblical commandments regarding blood and the body, or to God's authority over humans. Inversion and blasphemy often structure these ideas. One informant says, "Satan collects souls and the blood nourishes him. The blood is the soul according to the Bible. So this is a sort of partial sacrifice of your soul to Satan." Another, also stressing the transgression of biblical commands, says, "To spill your own blood is a bit like spilling your own seed, which is forbidden in the Bible. Both elevate man above the divine order. You make a stand with the dark side. A somewhat more pessimistic and despondent informant was less keen to glory in satanic empowerment, instead being set on emphasizing the bleakness of his satanic faith, but did so drawing on the same basic notions. He said, "Satan appreciates self-destructivity. It is part of his nature. God wants to keep his creation whole and pristine, and it says in the Bible that you are not allowed to spill the blood because it contains the soul. So this directly opposes God. It challenges his perfect creation and his law." A Gnostic undercurrent appears at times in the interviews, occasionally with direct references to Gnosticism. The flesh is then spurned as a prison created by God to trap mankind's divine essence, and cutting the flesh demonstrates hatred of this false shell. Purity is also something that is sometimes mentioned as a desirable result of cutting yourself, but it is unclear what the impurity you get rid of is thought to be. The words used in this context quite often appear similar to devout Christian discourse, but with subtle or direct subversive inversions. The theme of inversion also becomes clear in references to Christ. One informant says, "To cut yourself in Satan's honor is to blaspheme the wounds of Christ, with the blood gushing forth from them. What God's Son did for mankind, we do for the devil." Iconographically, there is a strong resemblance between black metal photos of self-injurious and the slender, sinewy, scarred and bleeding body of Christ in, for example, Grünewald's famous Renaissance paintings of the crucifixion. There's possibly a slide of that one as well. No, can back up. The theme of inversion also becomes... two of my informants also mentioned the self-mutilation of the possessed man in the Bible, and one of them joked that stones would probably be more appropriate than razors if you want to be truly orthodox. These examples show that it is quite usual to explicitly refer to the Bible in reflecting on one's own activities. This is unsurprising, since this type of Satanism, unlike many other varieties, in fact attaches great importance to the Bible. Two other informants, on the other hand, used Norse mythology to explain their actions. One says, "You can see a parallel to Odin. He hurts himself to gain esoteric insight. This is sort of the same thing. To let your blood flow is a way to open up for communication with the demonic, with Lucifer and his demons." The point both of them seem to want to make is that Odin's self-injury was instrumental, and I almost got the impression in one case that this was brought up as a defense against my mention of the fact that cutting yourself is commonly seen as pathological. If it is part of a rational spiritual economy where you get something back, it cannot, he seemed to say, be a sign of insanity. Other informants could, by contrast, happily concede that they were insane in some sense, but insisted that this was a different kind of madness, akin to diabolical possession or a sort of holy or rather unholy madness. The important thing for them was that it was emphatically not the same as anything that everyday, ordinary people might do. They were thus eager to specifically differentiate their own activities from secular self-injury. One of them excitedly asserted, "It must not be confused with the profane who cut themselves because they are depressed or something." There has been much scholarly debate concerning whether a disenchantment or secularization of the West ever occurred. There is no need in the present context to take sides in this discussion. Rather, it is sufficient to note that in the black metal milieu, an implicit or explicit view consistently appears to be that the world has indeed, lamentably, been disenchanted. It thus seems fair to say that the rhetoric underscoring how spiritual, religious and or ritualistic black metal is, or should be, is apparently an answer to this perceived predicament. The topos of disenchantment, then, is an intrinsic part of the internal logic of black metal Satanism's discursive struggle to construct and affirm a more spiritual form of Satanism and music. This endeavor seemingly encompasses most aspects of existence, and here transforms, at least internally in the milieu, the meaning of an action, self-injury, which could in some cases otherwise just as well be perceived as pathological or empty showmanship. Almost there. The strongly transgressive act of self-injury serves to prove loyalty to the satanic cause. Performed in private for oneself, On stage or in a small group setting, it leaves permanent marks on the body and serves to very tangibly display allegiance to Satanism, hereby building and upholding a transgressive identity. Moreover, as Vatsa points out, enduring self-harm in the adolescent initiation rituals of traditional cultures allow for a demonstration of inner strength. It functions similarly in black metal Satanism, letting the individual show complete devotion to Satan by withstanding pain and sacrificing vitality in the form of blood. Continued self-injury serves to affirm a continued allegiance. However, my impression is that while Satanists still cut themselves in private, public displays and sustained propagation of it has decreased. And the final slide and the very final point.
Really gonna have to, yeah. Quick.
At the same time, current research shows that self-injury is generally an increasing phenomenon among adolescents and young adults. This might in fact be one reason why it is seemingly declining in importance in the black metal milieu. It no longer functions well as a marker of transgressiveness when it is becoming more common among the general populace. In Sweden, the phenomenon was increasingly discussed in mass media from the late 1990s onwards, with a major boom in attention caused by a report in 2003. All right. Well, the point is that it thus became tainted by the everyday secular concerns that black metal Satanism strives to get away from in its re-enchanting, religionizing endeavors. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so who would like to ask more questions? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask, how do you see the black metal satanic side in the early 90s alongside the pagan black metal side that was also happening at the same time, in the same of bands like Immortal and Satirica and Bort Nagar, In the Woods? I don't know how much you know of those bands, who were not at all Satan allegiance, even though, for instance, Immortal were quite evil in their position as well. And some kind of this evil, could it be also the performance, and they were all very serious for the photos, and then they would have drinks and being relaxed in the backstage? Sure. To what extent the Satanist view that you presented here was actually lived in a cosmological and, you know, in a very heartful, felt way? So how much was it part of their life in general?
Yes, that's a very relevant question. Well, the early 1990s black metal scene was, after a very brief initial stage, it was sort of differentiated into two different scenes, which would have been the pagan part and the satanic part. And quite a few of the bands who were part of the scene early on indeed just had this as sort of a gimmick. They weren't really more religious than Venom had been back in their day. But there were bands who were fully committed to this as a sort of religion. And especially in Sweden, there was a development in the mid-1990s, a sort of back to Euronymous movement, where people again wanted to reaffirm the religious nature of what they were doing, and that this was indeed not mere entertainment. So, well, while I would not say that the black metal scene or milieu as a whole just consists of really sort of religious and devout Satanists, there is definitely a section of it, a rather specific section with a specific circle of bands, for example, Sweden's Watain, who are indeed very committed Satanists.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question, if I may. I'm a black metal performer, and I don't do any bloodletting like that or anything like that, like Watain or Behemoth or anything like that, but I do find a parallel between that and screaming on stage in the ability to transgress a border and to get an interiority to become an exteriority. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd be curious to know if you would frame that in a religious language.
Well, I'm a black metal scholar, so I'd find that a bit tricky, but I think certainly apophatic liturgy would be certainly the position that I come from. So I've started with that apophatic liturgy, and I've moved towards a position of witchcraft.
Thanks.
Anybody else? No? Okay, well, thank you very much.